You know how to hold it all together, but when it comes to your relationships, something's always missing. Welcome to Emotionally Wealthy, a podcast for high achievers who are ready to trade emotional disconnection for clarity, fulfillment, and relationships that are nourishing, not draining. I'm your host, Karen Conlon, licensed therapist, transformational coach, and your guide in turning insight into action. Are you ready for it? Let's do this. Welcome, everyone, once again to another episode of the Emotionally Wealthy podcast. I'm Karen Conlon, and today I am so excited to be joined by Dr. Jen Blanchette, a licensed psychologist, speaker, and educator who specializes in burnout, nervous system health, and talks about the emotional cost of chronic overfunctioning. Apart from her work with traumatic brain injury, Dr. Jen is particularly known for her work with therapists and high-achieving helpers who look successful on the outside, but feel depleted, disconnected, or sometimes trapped inside patterns of self-sacrifice. Through her clinical work, writing, and conversations on her very popular podcast, the Therapist Burnout Podcast, Dr. Jen explores how so many of us learn how to equate worth with competence, endurance, and being easy. I'm so looking forward to this very grounding and honest conversation about burnout and how burnout doesn't always look like burnout. And also what becomes possible when we give ourselves permission to live and work differently. Dr. Jen Blanchette, or Jen as I know you, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here on your show.
Thank you. Thank you. So just a little back context for everyone. Dr. Jen and I met because I was going through a bout of burnout. And I remember just listening to that, whatever episode it was. I don't think it was the first one necessarily, but I clicked on one and just everything that she said spoke to me in so many ways. I had never heard my experience being articulated in such a clear manner. And it resonated so much that I decided to reach out to her and work with her to help me through my own burnout process. So thank you for that. I'd love for you to maybe start with giving us a little bit of your backstory before you became the Therapist Burnout podcast host and really teach us all about all things burnout. Give us a little bit of background about how you ended up here.
Gosh, it's like where do you start the origin story? I'm not sure. Hi, I'm a human first. So I'm Jen. I'm happy to meet your listeners. And so how did I start this journey? I probably started this journey of being a helper when I was really small. I think I had windows into wanting to be a nurse and wanting to, do something to help other people. And I think life and circumstances and my conditioning brought me to the helping field. And I almost left quite a few times, actually. I worked as a therapeutic foster care in one of my roles in mental health, and I almost left at that point. And I decided to get my doctoral degree. And so that was like a little sidestep into, okay, let's go back and, get your doctoral degree. And I never thought I would burn out of therapy because I loved it.
Right.
And I really, I had so much supervision. I was like, okay, well, I talk about the work and I'm like, having all this support and all these friends and like, where did the friends go? Number one. And where did the support go when you become licensed? So those were two things that kind of happened. And in that time, I think from the work and working with foster care families, I wrote my dissertation on compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue in foster parents. And so I was going to trauma trainings in my training, trying to understand more of the helper's experience, understand compassion fatigue. And I was like, where are the people in these trainings, by the way? Because it's like tumbleweed. You go to a trauma training, no one goes to the compassion fatigue trainings. So I think if you are interested in this and you want to help other people, want to help helpers in this way, I would say specifically, you're a little bit of a unicorn because I think we a lot of us come to burnout, and I also came to burnout this way, in full surrender. And
Mm,
I came to it in both ways in my career. I really wanted to study it and understand it when I was in my 20s and 30s. And then my 40s came and it really hit me hard in the pandemic as a therapist.
yeah. Jen, what was it that was going on for you in your 20s and 30s? I want to ask that because I don't know, I think in my personal experience and in other people that I've worked with, it it feels like we don't really recognize burnout until a little bit later in life. So I'm really curious about what was going on or what it was that made you realize that there was this interest in burnout so early on, relatively speaking, in your life and in your career.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think it was in working in casework. So,
Yeah.
as a caseworker, even though I'm a psychologist, I feel like I have a social worker lens because I worked as a caseworker. And, I think if you look at the research on burnout,
Yeah.
caseworkers specifically have some of the highest levels of burnout that you'll see across
Yeah.
fields because we're dealing with children where often have high caseloads, high responsibility. And so I really felt compelled in a way to understand, like, well, how can I help other people who are coming new into this field and feel like they really want to make a difference? So I kind of became really soured in a way. Like I was all
Mhm.
bright eyed and bushy tailed coming into the field and like, do gooder Jen. She was going to change something. And then I kind of felt like I got chewed up and spit out in some ways as a young person
Yeah.
in the field and thinking I could affect change in these systems and I know I did good. Now I can see I did good. But at the time, I think I felt like I was failing the children I wasn't caring for as a
Yeah.
caseworker.
Well, I mean, and that brings me to the thought around number one, I think that that's a really common experience that when we go into the mental health field, we often come out of graduate school with this idealization of what the work is and actually how much impact we can have. And when I say that, I'm talking about the thought that we can fix other people's lives. And the
Mm,
truth is that that is not a role that we can or should take on because people have to do the work and do their own work in order to fix their lives. But I do think that when you come out of graduate school and you have that thought, or in some cases, in many cases, that sense of heavy responsibility. And then on top of that, you're also a high achiever or an overachiever. I think that those things really start to compound on the weight of what it is that we're supposed to be doing. What's our role? What's our responsibility? Um, and if we are already people that see ourselves as like super capable, then that actually can be a lot more, make the work a lot more difficult sometimes because it makes it difficult for us to kind of step back.
mm.
So I want to ask you, Jen, when you look back, would you say that you were always someone who others saw as like capable and responsible and sort of like the one that could handle things, or was that an identity that developed over time? I think you mentioned before that some of that started early on in childhood, so I'm curious, knowing what you know now,
Mm.
how would you say that that identity developed?
Yeah. I think part of that, like feeling competent and like I knew what I was doing, I definitely felt that more in grad school. I felt like I came in with a master's, a research master's. I did a experimental psych master's. I had like a orange vest and I was like recording traffic and that was fun.
Right.
Just in a random little like side pursuit, a side mission, just because I was like, what the hell do I do? I have a bachelor's in psychology. Okay, let's keep going to school. That seems like a good answer. Put some more
Yeah.
deposits in the psychology boat. Don't recommend it, but I did it and had some interest there. But that feeling competent, I think as a young person, I felt very unsure of myself.
Mm,
And so I think part of building I think almost pseudo confidence was getting all the degrees. It was like, okay, well, if I have these degrees and I do know something, then
Yeah.
I will be seen as more competent. And I feel like there is a part of me that does feel that, and that is very true. And then there's still those younger parts that feel like, what the hell are you doing? Like, what are you
Yeah.
doing here? And I think that always shows up for anyone, anyways.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, many of the people listening to this podcast were raised with the idea to be kind of good and accommodating and high performing, whether it was a direct verbal message or an indirect nonverbal message. And so I'm curious about when you first noticed how those early lessons were shaping the way that you worked or related, or even how you push yourself. Like, when did that self-awareness first really start to become solidified for you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it was gradual, and some of it was the socialization in the field,
Mm,
with, I think I remember distinctly this one situation where I was a caseworker and my dad was retiring from the government, and I wanted to go to his retirement, and my caseworker supervisor said, "You can't go. You have,"
mm,
I forget the type of meeting that we had when this was one in my 20s, so it's like 20 years ago. Anyway, my kid had a huge meeting that I was the caseworker for, and, well, you have to be there at that meeting. And so I didn't go.
mm.
And I was like, well, I I guess I have to be there for my job. And so that was one of those, I think, flashbulb memories. Not that
Yeah.
it is a flashbulb memory, but for me it is, because it's a different thing. But it's something that stands out to me as being like, why am I asked to do this? And that's not specific to the mental health field, but I think these themes of we we sacrifice of
Mhm.
ourselves to do the work. And that's part of what's the expectation, that you give something you really don't have to give, or you shouldn't. I should have been there at my dad's retirement party.
Mm. Would you say that that's a pattern that you see, that self-talk of, well, sure, you might have some thoughts about, well, is this okay? But then maybe saying, well, but I should be, or I need to be, rationalizing something that's actually going against your instinct. Is that a pattern that you continue to see within yourself, or even now as you've been spending so many years working with people, helpers, therapists, that you see with people who are outwardly competent but maybe inwardly exhausted?
Yeah, I think that we put these patterns on ourselves that, okay, the expectation. I love this post for therapists though. They're like, how many clients is full for you? And I'm like,
Oh, yeah, seriously. I mean, I have to say, every time that I see a post like that in one of our therapist groups or whatever, first of all, it makes me cringe because it's such a personal question. And second of all, there's so much judgment and shame and guilting that goes on around the responses.
yeah. And even because I'm in these forums sometimes, I'm just like a lurker looking,
Yeah.
like, I'm like, what are people talking about? And they'll get feedback. I just, one came to my mind of their clinical expectation. They were needing to be like 25 hours face to face clinical time. That's like
Mm,
face to face time if you're not a therapist in front of a client. That doesn't
yeah,
count all the other work that you need to do.
that's right.
And they
That's
couldn't
right.
do that. And then they felt like that they were getting written up because they weren't able to meet that expectation. And then they felt like a failure because they weren't able to do that.
Yeah. And so what that tells me is that there's a certain amount of overfunctioning that's happening, and at the same time a lack of recognition, either because your job doesn't allow it or your finances or your personal situation. But it sounds to me like there's this constant overfunctioning that happens and gets to a boiling point where our brains, our bodies kind of give out, and that shows up in different ways. But that overfunctioning that you're talking about here, um, I'm curious about, in your experience, how do people talk to themselves about it? Are they really admitting or able to acknowledge that that's what's happening? Tell me about some of the narratives that you've
Yeah.
heard, and maybe even some of the ones that you've said to yourself
Yeah. I
about what's
mean,
happening.
one I talk
Mhm.
about on my podcast all the time is that I don't trust myself, is one thing I said in the height of my burnout for probably a good year that I don't trust myself. My body's betrayed me,
Mm, yeah.
and I think working with a therapist is just the deep feeling of failure that, how could I have gotten this wrong? Like, what am I even going to do now that I can't do this job and this career that I spent really all my life working up to do? And
Yeah.
I think it's a hard reality to sit with, just like when you think of, okay, I dreamt of this career possibly my whole life, or maybe part of your young life you spent. For me, it was, geez, a lot of school, at least a
Mhm.
decade or more to get to the point where I got. And my personal story was opening and closing a private practice where I felt like, okay, this is what I thought was the end goal. This is where I kind of arrived and I landed, and this was the destination. I didn't like where I was. And then
Yeah.
it's sitting with that reality of, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, what does this even mean?
What happened to you then? What happened when you started to question these choices? And was the fact that you were questioning these choices clashing with your sense of duty and your sense of, achievement and your sense of, well, but I've dedicated myself to this. There's a lot of money and time
Mhm.
and effort being put into this. I'm curious about, what that internal experience was for you.
So much. I think there was one part was like the duty I felt to my clients, which I know that
Hmm.
you will understand, having a
Hmm.
therapy practice and holding on to people's stories. And, you'll see in a sitcom, what was I watching? SVU, because I like watching SVU, right?
Yeah.
And they go through something horrible in the show, and they both, one of them goes, "Are you okay? I got a therapist." And the other
Right.
one, "Well, are you okay with that? I have a therapist too."
Yeah.
I'm like, "Damn, they are really they're putting a lot on that therapist right now to carry them through seeing some horrific crime scene." And I'm like, so the role of the therapist today, I think, is trying to fill the need in our
Yeah.
society that we were never meant to do.
That's so
Never meant to do.
interesting. Yeah. Um, it makes me think of feeling, this is going to sound maybe strange, but kind of feeling caged because now we are in a position where you have very little margin to play with, who you are, your identity, the expectations, because it's kind of being put on you by whether it's social media or shows. As I grew up watching movies and TV shows, it's like the psychoanalyst in the back. You don't see their faces, you don't see their bodies, you only hear the voice, and you're sitting there on a chair, kind of looking like you're under a red lamp, like when you know, like a chicken nugget or something like that. It's being
Chicken.
warmed. And that's kind of like the visual that you see from old school movies and things like that. So when I thought of a therapist, that's what I thought it was. And now it's interesting because as we see TV shows, even, right? Like you see a lot of transparency around some of these therapy sessions that they go to. And it's a really interesting thing to watch develop because you and I both know that, sure, some of that might be true and real, but in reality, it's very different than what actually happens in the therapy space. And we're not always all sitting there beautifully polished and incredibly, made up and looking like we have it all together. So I'm wondering if, in your opinion, there's a pressure, there's an added pressure with the social media aspect and the television aspect of what it is that we're supposed to look like, how we're supposed to act, and also what it is that we're supposed to be solving for
Mhm.
people.
Yeah, so many layers there. I think the expectation, and I felt this a lot as a therapist when my clients were just so disconnected from other
Mm,
people. It's almost like I was their connection, and I wouldn't have said that in the time where I was a full-time therapist, but I felt like I was in many ways like the depth that they had emotionally with other people, they didn't have with other people. It was with me. The role of the therapist is really to try to get them to get the support outside of the room. And
Yeah.
in a lot of situations, either because of the client situation or whatever was going on with them, they just didn't have the support. And I think we're seeing that in society now with
Yeah.
kind of the loneliness crisis that's happened with the advent of social media and smartphones, that we become more disconnected as a society. And,
Yeah.
I think AI in some ways is filling this artificial gap of, being people's companion. I won't call it a therapist because it's not. And I think we're at the beginning to see what is going to be the fallout from that. If people use machines for companions, what's going to
Yeah.
happen from a mental health perspective when that doesn't work out?
So I'm glad that you brought up AI as another layer because, as you and I both know, this is, I mean, I don't know if it feels like exaggerating when I say it's a critical point, but I think that when you have people who are going to AI to use as a therapist, and by the way, I don't have an issue with people going to AI and kind of putting in a problem and right, but what
No,
we're
I do that.
talking,
I mean, I think it's
right?
it's a good use case if you have like an interpersonal problem, or you can kind of say, "Hey, I'm looping on this thought. Can you help me? I just need to get this thought out." Okay, great. That's a
Yeah,
specific use case to use it for, but not as an emotional support, that
yeah,
where that is the only person you're telling these difficult things to in your life.
yeah. And so now with AI being used not just as a, hey, let me help me get out of this loop or help me kind of suss out this decision that I need to make. Like, something kind of low level risk, with people going to AI and using it as a form of therapy to the extent that we have heard of very serious issues like suicides and people wanting to now thinking that they have relationships or actually feeling. I don't want to say thinking because perception is reality. And so
Yeah.
having these internal relationships with an AI platform, when I think about that and the output of information that they're getting, and then maybe going back to a therapist or a helper, this is what we're sometimes competing with is a model that is not really relating to people on a true, genuine, authentic level, but is giving them a lot of responses that they want to hear. You and I both know that in therapy, you don't always hear what you want,
Hmm.
but sometimes it is what's going to be helpful is not hearing what you want. And so I'm wondering if with all of these factors in mind, do we sometimes gaslight ourselves? Are we gaslighting ourselves into burnout because we're telling ourselves stories about who we should be, what we're supposed to know?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it's always yes and no, right?
Mhm.
Where does it come from? Like, how did we get here? How
Yeah.
did we get to the point where we believe that we have to live at this pace? And so
Mm.
I think we have to go back in time. Like, where does that come from? And
Yeah.
asking ourselves to do that. I think repeatedly asking ourselves to work beyond our capacities, to help beyond our capacity,
Yeah.
is how we're gaslighting ourselves in many ways. But I think that always comes from the system that we're in. And so I think, as for mental health providers, I don't know what your audience will be, or like who all that will listen to this,
Mhm.
high achievers or those who have been in systems where they've taught to get the good grade and to keep pushing and to give
Yeah.
110%. And what that gets you, you can do that for a certain amount of time until you can't.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think a lot of times we think the fix is to push harder. And when we tell ourselves that and we beat ourselves up in a way to do it, it's only going to land us into a place where we can't do anymore. And then we have
Yeah.
to look at ourselves again. So I think in that way, we can gaslight ourselves until we start to sit with like true surrender of, I can't live this way. This isn't the life that I want. And I think
Mhm.
everyone has to come to that conclusion for themselves. But in many ways, I would see that as self gaslighting.
Yeah. Well, and in that same thread, for those listeners who maybe have never fully understood burnout or what that self-gaslighting even sounds like, uh, can you give us some examples of that narrative or like that self-talk, some of the things, very specific things that you have heard or maybe even, like I said before, said to yourself?
Yeah, I think when I hear it from people, they keep saying like, "I have been saying I can't do this like this for
Yeah.
so long." And they keep pushing through it. They keep pushing it down. And I think especially one of the things that for therapists specifically, we struggle with interoception. And this is true for many women who are in helping professions.
What is interoception, if you can explain that to us?
Sure, interoception is being able to understand your body's signals, like I have to pee, I am
Mhm.
thirsty, I need to
Mhm.
eat. And I saw this a lot. I cared for a good number of nurses too.
Yeah.
And especially for them, because I think they just go into that, and for probably first responders and things of that nature. I'm not one,
Mhm.
haven't been one. But if you are in that situation where you are on and you are caring, and it's like stakes are life or death right there,
Yep. Yep.
it makes sense that for this short term, you need to have those signals. And that will happen when we're in a sympathetic dominance. When we're in fight or flight,
Yeah.
those signals need to die down so we can be present on the task at hand. Running
Yeah.
from the cheetah.
Yeah.
In this situation, even for a therapist, if we
Yeah.
were in a crisis with a client, our nervous system gets dysregulated. So we might push down some of those signals. It continues when we're outside of that situation.
Right. Right.
So we keep pushing, and our body is giving us these little nudges. It's like, hey, start to like, hey, we're hungry. Hey, we
Mhm.
can't do this. Hey, you've been like this all day. I'm like, if you're on listening to this on audio, I'm kind of in the computer position where my
Mhm.
shoulders are up to my ears.
Mhm.
And that has happened to me even recently. Like I can't, there's just so much writing that I can do in the role that I work. And so last week I had to really be mindful of my body like all week to get it out of a chronic flare. So now my body is like, you don't take care of me, I'm taking you out, girl. Out.
Yeah.
Out. But I think for people that have dealt with burnout, I think you can recognize the signs more readily. But when
Mhm.
it happens, and this is a very interesting process when I'm talking with people on burnout, they don't, there's not like burnout prevention. That's stress management.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
that's good. Do that. Do your wellness, work out, do all that stuff. When you are in burnout, it's like you don't even, the signs are gone. You are in,
Yeah.
you're burnt. I really say you're burnt, you're not burnout. You're burnt. Okay, so if you're fried, what do you need to do when you're fried? You need burnout recovery. You don't need burnout prevention, which is wellness anymore. If you're coming new into the field, new into a job, if you're in your 20s and 30s, wellness, stress management, really watching your boundaries, great, do all that stuff. And hopefully it will prevent something like becoming burnt or needing burnout recovery. But a lot of times, especially for women and high achievers, we push until we burn.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
research is pretty clear on that, that we don't burn out, we burn. And we're, like you've been left in the fryer. Did we talk about chicken nugget today? So it's like
Yeah.
fried
Yeah.
to a crisp.
Well, it's interesting that you said a minute ago that by the time you reach burnout, the signals are gone. And so I think it's probably fair to say that burnout doesn't always announce itself loudly, which is, I think, what people expect. I think people expect this, like, this moment of, oh, I can't take it anymore. Or this moment of just complete kind of shutdown. And the truth is that it, I think it happens quietly and it happens, uh, without sometimes innocuously, but it's always kind of knocking. Um, would you would you agree that sometimes burnout actually shows up as numbness, resentment, quiet depletion?
Mhm.
And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that if that is the case, because we've talked about the words, the sort of tangibles, the narratives that we tell ourselves about what's not happening and, how much we don't need and how much we are okay. But let's talk a little bit about the other ways that it shows up that we're not so accustomed to hearing about.
They show up in the ineffectiveness that burnout brings. So that's one of the
Mhm.
hallmark symptoms is we don't feel as effective in our jobs or in our roles. And so I think if we don't feel effective and then we feel trapped in some way, then resentment starts to grow. If you're working for a place, just really feeling like angry a lot of
Yeah.
the time. And I think for women, anger is a difficult emotion
Yeah.
because we often don't show it. And so it comes
Mhm.
out in sadness or in the fatigue. But I think certainly, I was very reactive as a therapist to clients and really felt ineffective to make the change that I wanted to and felt a deep resentment. Not really to them. Now I can say it wasn't to them, but to the
Mhm.
situation because
Yeah.
I at that time didn't have the resources to help them and myself get through that situation.
That's, I think, an important thing to really hone in on, because initially it can feel like resentment, in this case towards your client or towards a boss or towards a colleague or towards your spouse,
Towards your kids, I
towards
felt
your yeah,
a
towards
lot
your
of that in the
kid.
pandemic because I didn't have childcare, and I was, like, feeling very resentful of not having a break, not having time for myself, and
Yeah.
even becoming envious of other people's jobs, other people's lives, that they're in this pandemic and they don't have kids and they're just like, "Oh, what are you doing?" "I'm taking lots of naps." And I'm like, "Oh." I mean, even the little anger bubble comes up in that when I think of that moment and how people and we all struggled, we all had a difficult time in the pandemic, but I think resentment is an emotion that occurs because anger comes because it wants change. And so
Yeah.
when anger starts to bubble, it's telling us there's an injustice, there's something that needs to change here. And so it is not a positive or negative emotion, it is an emotion we have as humans.
Yeah.
And it's trying to motivate us towards change. It's trying to get us out of this situation. So it's a motivating emotion, although not always pleasant to experience. But I think if we listen to it, it has a message for us.
Yeah.
What is it speaking? So if someone who's listening to this now, I would ask them like, what is it saying? What needs to change?
That brings me to the question around, what are the emotions that then come up for people when they have realized that, uh-oh, maybe I do need to slow down. Maybe I do need to set some limits or put some guardrails for myself, right? So when they start realizing and maybe even accepting that this needs to happen, what are some of the emotions in your experience that comes up when they first start to even consider that as a possibility, slowing down?
Well, I think fear comes to the party often there.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
it can feel very scary to slow down because I think I will speak for me and what I've seen and the people that I work with is that what does that mean? If I slow down, then will I stop? Will I not be able to work? Will I crumble? I think a lot of
Yeah.
people kind of sit with that. And so it can feel very scary. And so what I find is that the first thing that we want to do is overfunction through burnout or depletion because we want to get out of it.
So, with your point about fear showing up, it gets me to thinking about how letting yourself need more or different even can feel so unfamiliar that it can even feel threatening, especially when you've built a life or an identity around performing, endurance, being able to handle things. And so that emotion that you described, like fear being one of the things that comes up, that that absolutely resonates. The other thing too that it makes me think about is grief. Is there a grief that comes up with realizing that you need to change or that you need to stop? Or maybe grief around realizing how long you've had to hold yourself together.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to think when grief comes in. I think I was grasping for much. I think I was in
Mhm.
fight or flight for a long time in the pandemic. We were all in that situation, I think, in the height of it. I think it
Yeah.
comes later, like when I could say for me, when I closed my practice, I felt a huge amount of grief saying all those goodbyes and then having the final moment of I felt a huge amount of relief. That was when I made the decision to close and then ultimately closed my practice, but also a huge amount of loss because
Yeah.
it felt like there was this chapter that was closing and then part of me was leaving. And I know that was for a season. Like I needed to have that end for a while so I
Mhm.
could figure out like what I can do and what felt good and what work fit into my life
Yeah.
versus like how do I make myself fit into a role that doesn't fit anymore. It doesn't fit me and I can't do this. And I've talked a lot on my podcast. That can be for a season of your life. My kids are young and they were very young in the pandemic. And so the expectation for me to be able to have that emotional resource, have
Mhm.
emotional wealth, as you talk about in your podcast, it's finite. Our resources are finite.
Yeah.
And so if they're depleted at home, because our kids need us, and that's where we need to put our investment emotionally in that season of life, then work has to be less. That's where we want the focus to be. And I understand that takes like holding two things like, I wanted to build this practice or I wanted to build this business or whatever you're trying to build or reach. But life is long and there might be time for that later. If your priority is your home life or your health, some people have health conditions and it kind of stops them from achieving the goals they want to achieve. Or this can
Yeah.
also happen where your goals change entirely on the other side of burnout, where you're like, okay, like for me, I was like, okay, maybe my podcast is going to be my new career and, I'm going to build all this business stuff. And then I'm like, well, I don't know, you know,
Yeah.
maybe that's not the goal anymore.
So, I mean, it sounds to me like you've been able to go from keeping yourself in a bit of a rigid mindset around what you can and should be doing to now, over the years, I guess redefining success or productivity. And one of the things that you've said in the past that truly resonated with me was you spoke about softening ambition rather than abandoning it. That spoke to me greatly because one of the fears, as what I call myself, a recovering high achiever, is that I have a lot of fears around abandoning ambition. Uh, but what you said there really helped give me permission when you said, well, what about softening it, right? To give myself a little bit more grace and slowing down, making it okay to slow down. So I'm curious for you, Jen, that redefining of success or productivity and softening your ambition, even like you were saying before, I thought the podcast was maybe going to do this and maybe now it's not that and it's okay. How would you say that has changed the way that you relate to yourself on
Hmm.
the day to day? What has changed about how you talk to yourself when things are not exactly going the way that you wanted them to or expected them to, for example?
Yeah, I think softening, I think, has you be softer to yourself. And
Hmm.
so if I don't have an ambitious goal anymore,
Yeah.
if my first goal is to like really have a container for work and for life that keeps me grounded as a
Yeah.
mother and as an employee. I'm not an employee, but I work contract for somebody. Like my work has to be in a certain silo so that I have enough resources.
Hmm.
And whatever is left over is part of that. Like, okay, well, maybe I still want to grow my podcast. Maybe I still want to do these other things. I think if we think of the timetable as like I'm building my podcast over years, not months, not okay. And this is a good example. I'll take you an example. I'll give you an example. So I first launched a podcast in 2021.
Hmm.
It was the TBI Therapist podcast. I podcasted on TBI. And I was like, no one is out here doing this. No one is talking about what people who have a TBI need. And my thing was like, okay, maybe I'm going to launch this private or this full fee private practice. And that's how I'm going to generate income. I'm going to get out of insurance, which I wasn't making the income I needed to make. Not that
Mhm.
I wanted to make the income I needed to make to support my family. So it wasn't a want, it was a need because I was not making the money I needed to make doing an insurance-based practice.
Mhm.
And so I had this ambition, but I was burnt out. I didn't have the emotional resources and the bandwidth to do it. And I launched a group once. I put one thing on Facebook, one thing out to my small little list, and I took that as no one signed up for it. That failed
Right.
because I didn't
Right.
have the resources. I didn't realize that to write a book or to do a podcast or the arc of that is in years,
Yeah.
not months, not months.
Mhm.
And I think when I launched the second podcast, I knew that. And I had much less success tied to it as this is a creative endeavor. And I heard this from Jason Branch, who, if you haven't found Jason Branch in your life, he's great. He hosts a Three Parallels podcast, and one thing he said on his podcast was, I am funding my healing on this podcast, and if nothing else, if I funded
Wow.
my own healing by hosting the Therapist Burnout podcast, and I know it wasn't my own healing that was the only thing that happened there. I think I helped with other people's healing. Then it was worth it. And
Yeah.
so for these creative endeavors, I think it has to be something greater than yourself because if just doing it was the thing that you did and you said, "Hey, I have this desire to do this thing," then you can say, "I did it. I gave it a good effort and I feel good about this work that I put into the world." And
Yeah.
so I think part of softening the ambition is softening like the outcomes with it. Like I am
Yeah.
just going to count uploads versus downloads.
What comes up for me when you say that, and thank you so much for sharing that about that podcast. I'm definitely going to check it out. I love that message because it really reminds us that if we can redefine or refocus what we're doing as a mission or a self healing rather than it being a goal or something to achieve or productivity, I think that helps to soften what we're trying to do and really take some of that pressure off. It just reminds us that wanting to soften your ambition does not mean that you have failed or that you've lost your edge. And I think that's an important reminder for the high achievers and the overachievers that listen to this podcast because high achieving and overachieving within the context of emotional wealth or emotionally wealthy as I define it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with money, success, or that type of achievement. It's really more about what are the things that have conditioned us? What are the factors, the environments that have conditioned us to think that achievement and productivity are the only worth or ways that we can be valued. So, thank you so much for reminding us of that and for giving us that resource.
And also with just one more, like Liz Gilbert talks about having no cherished outcomes. And I think that's a really good thing to think about when we launch something that is creative in some way, whether it be a book or a podcast or something like that, because it is this creative thing that you're putting in this world and it's not your baby. It's almost like a bird you're setting free. It's like, here's the bird. It's going, I don't know where it's gonna go. It could, if it was a book, maybe it'd be a bestseller, maybe it won't. Maybe it's just an idea out there and not all things will hit. And it doesn't mean you failed. It just means, hey, it wasn't for this time. And I think the drive for our society towards success and towards that achievement is it's not that, right? We always
Yeah.
think like if I do this, that means I get this many followers. And even in that, like we see how many people commented on our post. So there's these outward metrics that we see all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And so for listeners who are listening to you and things are just connecting, and they're sitting there quietly burned out, but still performing well, what do you wish they understood about what their exhaustion is trying to communicate?
I think what their exhaustion is communicating is that their body really needs to listen now.
Hmm.
You really need to listen to what your body needs. And it doesn't mean you failed. It just means you're tired. It just means that you can't live the way that you're living. It means nothing else other than that. And when you start listening to those little nudges and start doing little experiments, I think you start finding ways to grow your creativity and your play. And that's the way to find the next thing, is
Yeah.
to grow the space, because, everybody wants, like, okay, well, if I can't do therapy, if I can't do law, if I can't do medicine, or whatever the thing that you're leaving is, I need to have a plan. That's probably the last thing you need. The first thing you
Yeah.
need is to rest, to regulate, to find play again, so that you can know how to be open again to the world. Because when we're in threat, everything is closed off. Our creativity is closed off.
Yeah.
We don't feel alive anymore. So I think bringing that aliveness back is what I would ask you to do, to try to be curious, to play, to think about your younger self. What did she do? How did she play? How did she find it?
Yeah.
Because I think that
Yeah.
can be our pathway back.
Oh, I love that message. Just getting back in touch with that playful side of yourself that didn't take yourself that seriously and didn't take a life and the world so seriously. How do you define emotional wealth?
I think emotional wealth is really being able to experience all the expressions of our community, of being
Mhm.
able to play, to rest, to be creative, to get stuck, to get angry,
Yeah.
and then, like, figure things out. Like, if that happens, then we have pockets where we're feeling joy and love and those things in our bodies again. So I think
Yeah.
that's what emotional love looks like, is really being more in touch with our community.
Thank you so much. Dr. Jen Blanchett, thank you so much for being here. For anyone listening who is interested in maybe working with you or just exploring your work a little bit more, connecting with you, what's the best place for them to contact you?
Yeah, probably the Therapist Burnout podcast. So that's where you can reach me. And my website is drjenblanchett.com.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. And again, for everyone listening, Dr. Jen Blanchett is not just a joy, but her generosity with her information, the research, just all of the information that she really gifts us with. I think it's something for all of us to listen to and to look into. It's not just for high achievers and overachievers, although high achievers and overachievers tend to be a little bit higher risk of burnout because of the stories, especially that we tell ourselves about how we are fine. We don't listen to our bodies. We don't listen to those signals. So, Jen, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I can't wait for this episode to come out so we can give this to the world. And thank you all for showing up today for yourselves, for the podcast. Thank you for listening to Emotionally Wealthy. If you know someone who might benefit from hearing this episode on burnout and the things that we need to do to take care of ourselves, please go ahead and share it. If you're enjoying the show, feel free to put a review. It will help to let other listeners know that we're here. And until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and stay emotionally wealthy. See you next time. Oh, hey, quick reminder for you that this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional advice, diagnoses, or treatment. Always consult a qualified professional with any questions you might have.